In the previous videos of the series, I mentioned that I do not think that background knowledge is relevant for grand theories. This was mainly to avoid the pitfalls that background knowledge comes with when it comes to theism. Swinburne sees the criterion of background knowledge as being limited in its usage in that it is only applicable to explanations that have a narrow scope, as, according to Swinburne, the amount of evidence that resides within the background knowledge with which a given explanation will need to fit will decrease the range of its scope. Thus, in Swinburne's thought, there will not be any background knowledge that an explanation of enormous scope will need to fit with. In response to this, philosophers like Phillips argued that Swinburne's reasoning in support of one eliminating the criterion of background knowledge is fallacious, it is subject to the fallacy of division, and thus must be abandoned. In Swinburne's conception of theism, God is, amongst other things, an essentially everlastingly omnipotent, bodiless spirit. This conception of God has been challenged by individuals such as Phillips, who argues that the notion of a bodiless spirit fails to fit with our background knowledge concerning the type of entities that are taken to exist in neighboring fields. Swinburne doesn't take into account background knowledge, and this, I believe, hurts his project. The reason for this is that whenever we make probabilistic judgments about what a person or being would do, what Swinburne calls a personal explanation, we need to take into account their prior history as an individual, and then as being part of a class of individuals, in this case, the human species. Swinburne not using background knowledge means that we cannot make any probabilistic judgments about what God would do because we have no knowledge, no background knowledge of God's prior history as an individual, and God himself is unique in that he is his own reference class. In other words, we have no background knowledge about God's mental states to make any judgments about what he is likely to do. This objection comes from Gregory Dawes, Herman Phillips, J.L. Mackie, and J.H. Sobel in the literature. In response to this, Joshua Sijuwade proposes that God is a module trope. A module trope is an abstract particular in contemporary metaphysics. As Sijuwade says, the central claim provided by theism, that there is a God, a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope, fits very well with our background knowledge as it posits the existence of certain a type of entity, a trope that is at the foundation of contemporary metaphysics. Specifically, tropes are a standard feature of most current-day ontologies, where influential metaphysicians all have utilized the concept of a trope within their ontological system. Moreover, tropes do not only feature in the ontological systems of various metaphysicians, but are also plausible options for dealing with various issues within contemporary philosophy. That is, tropes, amongst other things, find their use in the metaphysics of properties by providing a means for one to affirm a form of realism, or in the metaphysics of persistence and identity by providing a basis for the notions of endurance and perdurance, or in the philosophy of physics by providing a philosophical basis for quantum theory and the standard model of elementary particles. Plausibly, the belief in the existence of tropes is widespread in contemporary metaphysics, and thus the postulation of the existence of God, identified as a module trope, meshes well with other theories from the neighboring fields within contemporary metaphysics. In a footnote, Sijuwade makes the point that one could raise the objection here that the notion of a personal trope is not widespread in contemporary metaphysics, and thus theism does not mesh well with our background knowledge. In response to this issue, one can emphasize the importance of the type-token distinction for the criterion of background knowledge. That is, for the postulation of the existence of an entity to be such as to fit within our background knowledge, this entity simply needs to be of a class, that is, a type, of entities that are taken to exist within other fields, rather than it being a particular instance of this class, that is a token, that is regularly seen to be duplicated. As if this were in fact the case, then one would not be able to make discoveries of new instances of a given class, which one clearly can. Thus, even though God is a personal module trope, that is, he is able to be picked out from the class of tropes by being personal, amongst other things, as tropes are a class of entities that are widely taken to exist in other fields within contemporary metaphysics, outside of the field of analytic philosophy of religion and analytic theology, the postulation of the existence of God is a postulation of a type of entity that does, in fact, fit within our background knowledge, even if he is a unique instance of this kind. Given this, if our model of theism is God as a module trope, then this fits with our background knowledge of tropes as discussed in contemporary metaphysics. In an earlier video, I made the argument that God's core property is absolute perfection. and that omnipotence is a derivative of this. Well, since making that video, I have updated my views on this, and now I view God's core property to be omnipotence and the other attributes to be identity relations. Now, getting into the specifics of my model of theism is beyond the scope of this video. However, the main point is that God as a module trope will fit well with the criteria of background knowledge, and hence this model of theism, when properly understood, can bypass the objections from Gregory Dawes, Herman Philipps J.L. Mackey, and J.H. Sobel. Another consideration when it comes to background knowledge is that if we adopt an alternative position such that background knowledge must just be literally everything that we hold to be true about the world, for example, that the sun exists, that the earth is round, that evolution is true, etc., then we run the risk of having different notions of background knowledge, since our background beliefs will be radically different, depending on our worldviews. Here, background knowledge would just be our background evidence. On this notion, we gather evidence sequentially, and so our background knowledge is really just background evidence, or evidence that we gathered before we look at some later sequential data. And people will have disagreements about how this plays out when we look at evidence sequentially. But regardless of, if we take a holistic view of background knowledge, by which we mean the relevant neighboring fields of metaphysics, or if we mean background knowledge as background evidence, it is clear that theism will not be in tension with our background knowledge.